Good morning, sixth grade. So, we're going to go ahead and start with chapter 24 today. And we're going to talk about imperialism and then leading into World War One.
Lesson 1. The New Imperialism. It matters because when we realize how imperialism controlled people's lives, we are able to appreciate the desire for freedom that later spread throughout the world. The rise of imperialism. Guiding question. Why did Europeans expand their empires at the end of the 1800s? During the late 1800s, Europe's leading countries rushed to gain territory in Asia and Africa. Three key factors sparked this race for land overseas. 1. European nations wanted more power. 2. The Industrial Revolution created a demand for raw materials and new markets. And 3. Europeans wanted to impose their ideas and cultures on other peoples. As a result, in the late 1800s, the world entered the age of imperialism. Imperialism is the direct or indirect control of one nation by another nation. Britain and France were the leading builders of overseas empires. Other nations soon followed. These imperial nations ruled other peoples in different ways. Sometimes they created a colony, which they ruled directly through appointed officials. Sometimes they set up a protectorate. There, the local people had their own government, but the imperial government controlled the military and could tell the local rulers what to do. In other cases, they set up a sphere of influence, a region where only one imperial power has the right to invest or to trade. Europeans in Southeast Asia. When the age of imperialism began, many European nations already held lands in Southeast Asia. As early as the 1500s, Europeans had traveled to the region for its spices. The Dutch occupied the East Indies, while the Spanish controlled the Philippines. During the 1800s, the British moved into the mainland of Southeast Asia. In 1819, a British government official founded a British colony that became an important port. Located on a small island off the Malay Peninsula, the colony was called Singapore, or the City of the Lion. The French followed the British to mainland Southeast Asia and competed for territory. Burma, present-day Myanmar, and the entire Malay Peninsula came under British control. Meanwhile, French missionaries entered nearby Vietnam, making it a protectorate in 1883. Siam, present-day Thailand, was the only Southeast Asian country to keep its freedom. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Europeans made enormous profits from their Southeast Asian holdings. However, the riches were earned at the expense of the local people. European officials, traders, and landowners forced Southeast Asians to grow coffee, tea, and other crops for export. Southeast Asian workers also mined or harvested the area's raw materials: petroleum, rubber, tin, and valuable woods. Progress check. Describing. How did Europeans rule their overseas territories? The British in India. Guiding question. What were the effects of British rule in India? India was another Asian land that came under European rule. Europeans were trading in India as early as 1600. At this time, a Muslim group called the Mughals ruled India. During the next 100 years, Mughal power weakened. Mughal rulers taxed people heavily and wasted money on wars and palaces. Some of them also tried to force Hindus, most of India's people, to accept Islam. Growing discontent made it easy for Europeans to take over India. Struggle for India. In the 1600s and 1700s, British traders from the East India Company extended their control in India. They built trading posts in strategic places along India's coast. They set up their own army and supported local Indian rulers who agreed to work with them. Meanwhile, traders from France used the same methods and challenged Britain for control of India's trade. Robert Clive, an East India Company official, led British and Indian soldiers against French forts. In 1757, Clive's force defeated the French and their Indian allies. The conflict left the French with only one fort and a few coastal holdings. During the next 100 years, Britain's East India Company took over much of India. Company officials prospered. They also introduced European ideas to India's people. Many Indians, however, felt that the British were trying to change their culture. By the mid-1800s, Indian discontent with the East India Company had increased. In 1857, sepoys, or Indian soldiers in the company's army, revolted against their British officers. In some places, the revolt resulted in massacres of British citizens. British troops arrived in India and crushed the rebellion. As revenge for the massacres, the British killed thousands of Indians. The revolt left bitterness on both sides. It forced the British to tighten their control of India. What is the Raj? In 1858, Britain took direct control of India from the East India Company. British India's government was known as the Raj, which is from the Sanskrit word for ruler. The Raj was headed by a British official called a viceroy. Viceroy refers to a high official who stands in for the British monarch. The British did bring order and unity to India. They provided good administration and a well-run government. Under the Raj, communication and education improved. The British introduced railroads, the telegraph, and a postal service to India. British rule, however, also introduced great hardships. Cheap British fabrics flooded India and destroyed the local textile industry. The British also forced many Indian farmers to grow cotton instead of wheat. Soon India was not growing enough food to feed its people. In the 1800s, millions of Indians died of starvation. Indian National Congress. Many Indians were angry about the policies of the Raj. They wanted to move India towards self-rule. In 1885, Indian business and professional leaders formed a political group called the Indian National Congress. Many members of the Congress had been educated in British-style schools. At first, the Congress worked for gradual change. They hoped to gain some level of self-rule over time. When this effort failed, the Congress began a campaign for full independence. Progress check. Explaining. How did British rule of India change in 1858? European rule in Africa. Guiding question. Why did Europeans compete to take over Africa? Africa was the last populated continent to be colonized by Europeans. In the 1500s, European traders arrived on Africa's west coast. In the mid-1800s, explorers, like Scottish doctor missionary David Livingstone, opened up the African interior. During the late 1800s, European powers scrambled to gain control of as much of Africa's rich resources as they could. North Africa. In the early 1800s, French armies captured Algeria in North Africa. The French later seized Tunisia and claimed Morocco. In 1904, France divided Morocco with Spain. Meanwhile, European businesses developed in Egypt. The Europeans and Egyptians constructed the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869. The canal linked the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Britain took control of the canal in 1875 and eventually made Egypt a protectorate. West Africa. The Europeans turned next to West Africa. European merchants had been involved for centuries in the trading of enslaved West Africans. In 1833, however, Britain ended slavery in its empire. Other European countries soon followed. Europeans then sought out West Africa's gold, timber, hides, and palm oil. Britain, France, and Germany took over Africa's Atlantic coast. Eventually, they moved inland. Soon the only place in West Africa not controlled by Europeans was Liberia. It was founded in 1847 by freed African Americans. European expansion, however, was challenged. In the 1890s, West African rulers led armies against the Europeans. Well-armed European armies, however, defeated the West Africans. Central and East Africa. European control of Central Africa began when King Leopold II of Belgium claimed much of the Congo region. Under his rule, the Congolese people were forced to work on rubber plantations. Complaints from missionaries and other Europeans forced the king to turn over the Congo to the Belgian government. The government finally ended the forced labor system. Leopold's move into the Congo spurred other European powers into action. They divided the rest of Africa among themselves, with two exceptions. In East Africa, the Italians tried but failed to conquer Ethiopia. Ethiopia, like Liberia in West Africa, remained independent. South Africa and the Boer War. In South Africa, the European push to acquire new colonies led to the Boer War. In the 1600s, Dutch settlers founded Cape Town on the southwestern coast. Those settlers became known as Boers, the Dutch word for farmers. In the early 1800s, Britain seized the Dutch territory and renamed it Cape Colony. To escape British rule, the Boers moved inland. They named their new settlements the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Britain's Cape Colony was governed by Cecil Rhodes, the owner of many gold and diamond companies. When British settlers discovered gold and diamonds in the Transvaal, Rhodes decided to take the territory from the Boers. War erupted in 1899 and ended with the defeat of the Boers 3 years later. In 1910, Britain formed the Union of South Africa. Boer and British settlers ran this new country. They did not allow the much larger non-white population to have a role in the government. As a result, black South Africans founded the African National Congress to fight for black rights. How did imperialism affect Africans? Europeans greatly affected the lives of Africans. Europeans grew wealthy from mines and plantations. African workers received low wages and had to pay taxes in cash. European schools taught Africans that European ways were the best. In some places, African traditions declined as a result of European influences. By the early 1900s, a small group of European-educated Africans had emerged in many African colonies. These Africans condemned colonial rule as contrary to European ideals of liberty and equality. They founded nationalist groups to push for self-rule. Progress check. Explaining. Why were Europeans drawn to Africa in the 1800s? Thinking like a historian. Making inferences. Historians make inferences about what they read. Read the paragraph beginning, "In 1910, Britain formed the Union of South Africa." It says that the African National Congress was created, but not why. The reason must be inferred by the reader. Make an inference based on the details in the reading. Tell what you can infer about the living conditions for black South Africans. Write your inference in a sentence or two. For more information about making inferences, read the chapter, "What Does a Historian Do?" America's Quest for Empire. Guiding question. How did the United States build an overseas empire? In the late 1800s, the United States joined the race for colonies. Many American government and business leaders believed that they needed raw materials and new markets to keep the U.S. economy growing. The Spanish-American War. In the late 1800s, the United States gained territory in Latin America and the Pacific. At that time, Spain still ruled the Caribbean islands of Puerto Rico and Cuba. However, in 1895, the Cubans began a revolt against Spanish rule. In 1898, President William McKinley sent the U.S. battleship Maine to protect Americans living in Cuba. While anchored in the harbor of Havana, Cuba's capital, the ship exploded. Many Americans blamed Spain and called for action. In April 1898, President McKinley asked Congress to declare war. The Spanish-American War lasted only 4 months, ending with an American victory. Cuba became a republic under American protection. The U.S. also gained Puerto Rico and the Pacific islands of Guam and the Philippines. In 1898, the Pacific islands of Hawaii came under American control. 5 years earlier, American settlers had overthrown the Hawaiian queen, Liliuokalani. However, Congress did not approve American control of Hawaii until after the end of the Spanish-American War. The United States and Latin America. Following the Spanish-American War, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt pushed to build a canal across Panama to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. At that time, Panama was part of Colombia. The Colombians refused to give up land needed for the canal. In 1903, Americans helped the people of Panama revolt. Once Panama won its independence, it let the U.S. build the canal. Construction began in 1904 and took 10 years to complete. Progress check. Analyzing. How did the United States gain the rights to build the Panama Canal?